winter of 1944, the Ardennes, the coldest, cruelest weeks of the war in the West, when the temperature fell far below freezing, and the snow lay deep across the forest, and men on both sides died not only from bullets, but from the cold itself, from frostbite, from exposure, from the slow, quiet killing of a body that can no longer keep itself warm. And in that frozen forest, a group of German soldiers comes upon the body of an American soldier, fallen in the snow, and they do what soldiers do. They search him for intelligence, for anything of use. And what they find, on him and in his pack, tells them something that cuts deeper than the cold. If you were one of those German soldiers, you were, yourself, freezing. This is the essential thing to understand, the thing that gives the discovery its terrible weight. By this stage of the war, the German army was desperately short of proper winter equipment. Many German soldiers faced that appalling winter inadequately clothed, in worn uniforms, without proper cold weather gear, their boots letting in the wet and the cold, their bodies never warm, the frost getting into them and staying there. German soldiers froze in enormous numbers that winter, suffered frostbite that cost them fingers and toes and feet, and endured a cold that was itself a mortal enemy, because their nation could no longer supply them with what they needed to survive it. So when you, a freezing German soldier, knelt in the snow beside a fallen American and began to go through his belongings, you were not just searching an enemy, you were, whether you meant to or not, comparing his condition to your own. And what you found was a lesson in the difference between the two armies, written in the most basic and human terms there are, in warmth, in comfort, in the simple question of whether a soldier's own nation had given him what he needed not to freeze. You found that the American was warm, or rather, that he had been equipped to be warm, that his clothing, his boots, his gear, all of it, was designed and supplied to keep him alive and functioning in exactly the cold that was killing you. You found layers of proper cold weather clothing. You found boots meant to keep out the wet and the cold. You found, in his pack, spare dry socks, the simple, life-saving luxury of dry socks, which we have spoken of before, and which the German soldiers so often did not have. You found gloves, and warm layers, and perhaps the small heat source packets that could warm cold hands, and rations to fuel the body against the cold, and all the small, thoughtful items of a soldier equipped by a nation that had decided its men should not freeze. And you found, too, the human things, the letters, the photographs, the small personal items that told you this frozen enemy had been a man, with a home and people who loved him, exactly as you were, exactly as your own frozen comrades were. And kneeling there in the snow, freezing, going through the belongings of a better-equipped enemy, you would have understood something that no propaganda could argue away, and no courage could overcome. The difference between you and this dead American was not courage, and it was not skill. It was that his nation had given him what he needed to survive the winter, and yours had not. He had died anyway. The cold and the war take the well-equipped and the poorly equipped alike, but he had faced that killing winter with every advantage his rich nation could provide, while you faced it with almost nothing, and the gear on his frozen body was the proof. This is not a story about a dead soldier. This is a forensic audit of what the German soldiers found on a frozen American in the snow, of the vast gulf in winter equipment between the two armies, and of what it meant that even in the simple, brutal matter of not freezing to death, the American soldier was supplied on a scale the German soldier could only envy, and of the shared human truth, in the letters and the photographs, that underneath the gear and the uniforms, the frozen men of both armies were the same. Part 1. The German Calculus. To understand the weight of what those German soldiers found, you have to understand how catastrophically the German army had failed to equip its men for winter. And why? Because the German winter equipment crisis was one of the most lethal and most telling failures of the entire German war effort. The German army's winter equipment problem was, at its root, the same problem as everything else we have examined: scarcity. Germany was fighting a war beyond its resources, blockaded, stretched, unable to produce and supply everything its enormous military needed. And winter equipment, the proper cold weather clothing, the insulated boots, The gloves and the layers and the specialized gear needed to keep a soldier alive and functioning in deep cold was expensive, resource-intensive, and vast in the quantities required to equip millions of men. And Germany, faced with the impossible task of supplying everything, could not supply enough of it. And this failure had been catastrophic on the Eastern Front, where the Russian winter had killed and maimed German soldiers in staggering numbers who were not equipped to survive it. A disaster so severe and so well documented that it became a symbol of the German failure to prepare for the war it had started. The image of German soldiers freezing in the Russian snow, inadequately clothed, is one of the enduring images of the war, and it was a direct consequence of a supply system that could not provide winter equipment on the scale required. And the same failure appeared in the West, in the Ardennes winter. When the Germans launched their great offensive in that terrible cold, many of their soldiers were inadequately equipped for the conditions, and they suffered accordingly. Frostbite, exposure, the whole toll of cold on inadequately protected men. Even in this last great effort, on their own western frontier, the German army could not properly equip its soldiers against the winter, and men froze who might have survived had they been clothed and shod as the enemy was. Now, this was not because the German army did not understand the importance of winter equipment. It understood perfectly well, having learned the lesson in blood on the Eastern Front, that cold kills soldiers and destroys fighting power. The failure was not one of understanding, but of capacity, the same fundamental inability to produce and supply enough that ran through the whole German war effort. Germany knew its men needed proper winter gear. It simply could not provide it in the quantities required, because its resources were stretched past breaking and its supply system was collapsing. And there is a bitter dimension here about priorities and scarcity. When a nation cannot supply everything, it must choose, and the choices are agonizing. Fuel or winter clothing? Ammunition or boots? The German war economy, desperately short of everything, could not fully supply any category, and the individual soldier, at the end of that failing supply chain, was the one who paid, freezing in the snow because somewhere up the chain there had not been enough of everything, and winter clothing had been one of the many things there was not enough of. So the German soldier who knelt beside the frozen American was himself a product of this failure, cold, inadequately equipped, suffering in a winter his nation had not prepared him for. And that is precisely why what he found on the American struck so deep. He was not comparing his gear to the enemy's from a position of comfort. He was comparing it while freezing, while suffering the direct physical consequences of his own nation's inability to keep him warm, and the warmth built into the dead American's equipment was a direct rebuke to everything his own supply system had failed to provide. That is the German calculus. An army that understood the lethal importance of winter equipment, having learned it in catastrophe on the Eastern Front, but that could not supply it, because of the same fundamental scarcity that afflicted everything, so that its soldiers froze, in the East and in the West, inadequately clothed against a killing cold, and a freezing German soldier going through a dead American's winter gear was confronting the physical evidence of his own nation's failure to keep him alive. Now let us look at how the American soldier came to be so much better equipped for the cold. Part 2. The American Answer. The warmth built into the American soldier's equipment, the warmth those freezing German soldiers found on the frozen body in the snow, was the product of the same combination we have found behind every American advantage: vast industrial abundance, a sophisticated supply system, and a philosophy that held the individual soldier's survival and comfort to be worth an enormous investment. Start with the abundance. The United States could produce winter clothing and equipment in the vast quantities required to equip millions of soldiers, because its industry was enormous and untouched by the war, and its resources were effectively unlimited. Where Germany had to ration and choose and go short, America could produce the cold weather clothing, the insulated boots, the gloves, the layers, the specialized gear, in the quantities needed to supply its whole army, without the agonizing trade-offs that scarcity forced on the Germans. The foundation of the American winter advantage was simply that America could make enough of everything, including the equipment to keep its soldiers warm. Then the design and the thoughtfulness. The American military put real effort into developing effective cold weather clothing and equipment, layered clothing systems designed to trap warmth and manage moisture, boots designed for cold and wet, the whole apparatus of keeping a soldier functional in deep cold. This reflected a systematic approach to the problem of the individual soldier's survival and effectiveness, the same approach we have seen in the rations and the medical care and everything else, the treatment of the soldier's basic needs as a problem worth solving with real engineering and real resources. And then the delivery. It is not enough to produce winter equipment, it must reach the soldier at the front, in the cold, when he needs it. And the American supply system, for all its imperfections, delivered winter equipment to its soldiers on a scale the Germans could not match. Now, we must be honest here, because the American winter supply was not perfect. In the Ardennes, the sudden onset of the battle and the winter caught some American units short of the ideal winter gear too, and American soldiers also suffered from the cold, and there were real failures and shortages in getting the right equipment forward in time. The American system was not flawless, and American soldiers froze too. But the baseline, the general level of winter equipment available to the American soldier, was far above what the German soldier could expect, and the abundance meant that shortfalls could be made up, that the system could recover, that on the whole, the American soldier faced the winter far better equipped than his enemy. Consider the specific things those German soldiers would have found, each one the end point of this system. The layered warm clothing, the product of American textile industry and cold weather design. The insulated water-resistant boots, a critical item, because feet are where the cold does its most crippling work, and dry, warm feet are the difference between a functioning soldier and a frostbite casualty. The spare dry socks, that simple, life-saving item we have discussed. The ability to change into dry socks being one of the most important protections against the trench foot and frostbite that destroyed so many feet. The gloves and the warm layers. The rations to fuel the body's own furnace against the cold. Perhaps the small chemical heat packets. Each of these was a small piece of a system designed and supplied to keep the American soldier alive and functioning in the cold, and each was something the German soldier so often did not have. And behind all of it was the philosophy that has run through this entire channel, the conviction that the ordinary soldier was worth keeping alive, worth keeping warm, worth the enormous investment required to equip him properly against the winter. The American system did not regard winter equipment as a luxury or an afterthought. It regarded the soldier's survival and effectiveness as a priority worth vast resources, and it had the abundance to act on that priority. The warmth on the frozen American's body was the physical expression of a nation that had decided its soldiers should not freeze, and had the means to act on that decision. There is, of course, the terrible irony that the American on whom the Germans found all this warmth was dead. The equipment did not save him, because equipment cannot save everyone, and the cold and the war kill the well-equipped along with the poorly equipped. But the point is not that the equipment made the American invulnerable. The point is that his nation had given him every advantage it could in the fight against the cold, while the German soldier's nation had given him almost nothing, and that difference, visible on the frozen body in the snow, was the difference between the two war machines, expressed in the most basic human terms. The Germans sent their soldiers into the winter inadequately clothed, because they could not do better. The Americans sent theirs in as warm as a rich and thoughtful nation could make them. And even in death, the warmth built into the American's gear was a rebuke to the scarcity that had left the German freezing beside him. Part 3. The River of Steel. The warmth found on the frozen American connects to the deepest themes of this channel, and it does so in the most human and visceral way, because it is about the most basic thing of all, whether a soldier's own nation kept him from freezing to death. It connects, first, to the theme of abundance as the foundation of everything. The winter equipment was one more expression of the American material superabundance we have traced through food and fuel and ammunition and every other category. America could equip its soldiers against the cold because America could make enough of everything, and the warm clothing on the frozen body was the war economy, expressed as the difference between warmth and freezing. The abundance that showed up as full supply trucks and overflowing ration boxes showed up here as the simple fact that the American soldier had proper boots and dry socks and warm layers, and the German soldier did not. It connects to the theme of the system that delivered abundance to the individual soldier. Producing winter equipment is not enough. It must reach the man in the snow. And the American logistical system, for all its imperfections, delivered warmth to the front on a scale the German system could not match. The gear on the frozen American's body was the end point of a supply chain that ran back to American factories, the same integrated system of production and delivery we have found everywhere, reaching all the way to the individual soldier's feet and hands in the frozen forest. It connects, most powerfully, to the theme of the value placed on the ordinary man. Winter equipment is, in a sense, the purest possible expression of a nation's concern for its individual soldiers, because it serves no purpose except keeping the man alive and functional. It does not kill the enemy, it does not win battles directly, it simply keeps the soldier from freezing. And the lavish provision of it reflects a philosophy that held the soldier's survival to be worth the investment for its own sake. The warm gear on the American body, contrasted with the freezing German beside it, is the clearest possible illustration of the difference in how the two nations valued and provided for their ordinary men. And it connects, through the letters and photographs found alongside the gear, to the deepest human truth of all, the one we found in the pockets of the dead, and find again here. The frozen American was a man, with a home and people who loved him, and the German who found him was a man too, freezing, far from his own home and his own people. In the shared reality of the killing winter, in the letters and photographs that were the same on both sides, in the simple human vulnerability to the cold that took men of both armies, there is the recognition that underneath the difference in equipment, the frozen men of both sides were the same, ordinary human beings, loved and loving, sent to suffer and die in a frozen forest by forces far larger than themselves. The German soldier, kneeling in the snow beside the frozen American, was confronting all of this at once, the material abundance that had warmed the enemy and the scarcity that had left him freezing, the system that valued the enemy's survival and the failure that had abandoned his own, and the shared human truth that beneath it all, both of them, the frozen dead and the freezing living, were the same. Part 4. The German Realization. The realization that came to the German soldier in the snow was layered, and it went from the immediate and physical to the deeply human, and every layer of it was bitter. The immediate realization was physical and undeniable. The enemy was better equipped for the cold. A freezing German soldier, going through the gear of a well-equipped American, could feel the difference in the most direct way, could see the proper boots he himself lacked, the dry socks, the warm layers, the equipment designed and supplied to defeat the very cold that was tormenting him. This was not an abstraction. It was a sensory, physical lesson, delivered to a suffering man, and it needed no explanation. The deeper realization was about the two systems, and about failure. The German soldier, if he thought about it, understood that the difference in equipment was not an accident or a matter of individual luck. It was systematic. The American was well-equipped because his whole army was well-equipped, supplied by a nation that could provide winter gear in abundance. The German was poorly equipped because his whole army was poorly equipped, failed by a nation that could not. And this meant that the freezing German soldier was suffering not because of anything he had done or failed to do, but because of a systematic failure far above him, a failure of his nation to provide what he needed to survive. There is a particular bitterness in understanding that your suffering is the result of your own side's failure, and that the enemy's soldiers, even the dead ones, had been better cared for by their nation than you had been by yours. And this fed into the broader realization that ran through the whole German experience of the war, that they were fighting a nation whose material abundance and whose care for its soldiers vastly exceeded their own. The winter equipment was one more piece of evidence, and a peculiarly visceral one, because it touched the most basic matter of physical survival. A German soldier could perhaps rationalize being outnumbered or outgunned. It was harder to rationalize the enemy's dead being better dressed against the cold than the living men of your own army. The gear on the frozen American said, in the plainest terms, that the enemy took better care of its soldiers than Germany took of its own, and that was a hard and demoralizing thing to understand while freezing in the snow. And the deepest realization was the human one, and it transcended the war. In the letters and photographs found alongside the gear, in the simple humanity of the frozen enemy, the German soldier confronted the shared reality that he and this dead American were the same, both men, both loved, both sent to freeze and die in a war neither had made. The cold did not care about nations. It took men of both armies. And in the frozen forest, going through the belongings of a man as human as himself, the German soldier could see, if he let himself, the terrible shared truth beneath the war, that the frozen dead of both sides were somebody's, and that the winter that was killing them both made no distinction between the well-equipped and the poorly equipped, the German and the American in the end. The German soldier, standing up from the frozen body, with his hands full of the enemy's warmth and the enemy's letters, understood more than he had wanted to. He understood that his nation had failed to keep him warm while the enemies had succeeded. He understood that the difference between the armies reached all the way down to the most basic matter of not freezing. And he understood in the letters and the photographs that the enemy he was fighting was made of men exactly like himself, freezing and dying in the same cruel winter, on the same frozen ground. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle fought in the Ardennes that terrible winter, or in any of the winter battles, and endured the killing cold, or if he was one of those who did not come home from it, I would be grateful to hear his name and his unit in the comments. The winter of 1944 was one of the cruelest of the war, and the men who fought in it, on both sides, endured a cold that is hard for the rest of us to imagine, and many of them froze, and many died, and their suffering deserves to be remembered. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. The winter of 1944 passes into the spring of 1945, and the war grinds on toward its end, and the frozen forests of the Ardennes give up their dead as the snow melts. Men of both armies who died in the cold, some well-equipped, some not, all of them equally gone. So here is the verdict. The German soldiers who found the frozen American in the snow found, on his body and in his pack, the whole story of the war, written in the most basic human terms there are. They found warmth, the layered clothing, the proper boots, the dry socks, the gloves, the equipment designed and supplied to keep a soldier alive in the killing cold, and they found it while freezing themselves, inadequately equipped by a nation that could not provide what they needed to survive the winter. The difference between the warm gear on the dead American and the inadequate gear on the freezing German was the difference between the two war machines, expressed in the simplest and most brutal possible form. The American was well equipped because his nation had the abundance to produce winter gear for millions, and the philosophy that held his survival to be worth the investment. The German was poorly equipped because his nation, stretched past breaking, could not provide it, and had to let its soldiers freeze because there was not enough of everything to go around. And the verdict is the one this channel has reached, from every direction, delivered here in its most human form. The Germans were not beaten by a braver or more skillful enemy. They were beaten in part by an enemy who could keep his soldiers warm while they froze, by a material abundance and a systematic care for the individual soldier so far beyond what Germany could provide that even the enemy's dead were better protected against the cold than Germany's living. A nation that can keep its soldiers warm, fed, supplied, and cared for, while the enemy's soldiers freeze and starve and go short, is a nation that will win a long war, because war is not only battles, it is the endless grinding test of which side can keep its men alive and functioning, and the Americans could, and the Germans, increasingly, could not. But there is a deeper verdict, too, in the letters and the photographs found alongside the gear. Beneath the vast difference in equipment, the frozen men of both armies were the same, ordinary human beings, loved and loving, sent to suffer and die in a frozen forest. The winter took them both. The cold made no distinction. And in the shared humanity of the frozen dead, on both sides, There is a truth that outlasts the war and its material calculations. That these were people, that they were loved, and that they died, too many of them, in the snow, far from home. The Germans sent their soldiers into the winter with too little, because they had too little to give. The Americans sent theirs in with the abundance of a nation that could keep its men warm, and the warmth on the frozen body in the snow was the whole war in a single, human, heartbreaking image. The enemy's dead, better cared for than you're living, in the cruelest winter of the war. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these. More systems, more decisions. More of the invisible, unglamorous machinery and the human reality behind the war. And remember this about the frozen soldier in the snow. Nobody makes a film about winter clothing, about the dry socks and the warm layers and the proper boots that keep a soldier from freezing. It is the least glamorous equipment imaginable, the furthest thing from the tanks and the planes and the guns that fill the histories. And yet in that terrible winter, warmth was as decisive as any weapon, because a frozen soldier cannot fight, and a soldier without proper boots loses his feet, and an army that cannot keep its men warm loses them to the cold as surely as to the enemy. The German soldiers who knelt beside the frozen American, freezing themselves, found on his body the warmth their own nation could not give them, and understood, if they let themselves, that they were losing to an enemy who could do the one thing their own side could not, keep its soldiers warm enough to survive. And they found, too, the letters and the photographs, and understood the other truth, that beneath the gear and the uniforms, the frozen enemy was a man exactly like themselves, loved and lost in the same cruel winter. Mostly, when an American soldier faced the winter, his nation had given him what he needed to survive it. And even when the cold took him anyway, the warmth on his body was the mark of a nation that had tried, with all its vast abundance, to bring him home. They deserve to be remembered, the men of both armies who froze in that terrible winter, the well-equipped and the poorly equipped alike, by the simple, human, heartbreaking truth that in the end, the cold took them all the same, and that beneath the vast difference in what their nations could give them, they were the same, ordinary men, loved and lost in the snow, far from the homes they carried in their pockets to the very end.